9 o'clock in the morning, October 25, 1854, near the port of Balaclava in the Crimea. 93 Scottish Highlanders stand in a two-rank line, just 2 men deep, watching 2,000 Russian cavalry thunder toward them across open ground. Every military manual says this is suicide. Infantry facing cavalry must form square, creating 4 walls of soldiers bristling with bayonets, presenting no vulnerable flank. A two-rank line has exposed flanks. Cavalry can ride around the ends, attack from the side, roll up the entire formation like a carpet. But Sir Colin Campbell, the 62-year-old commander, has refused to form square. His Highlanders stand in that impossibly thin red line stretching across the ridge. The Russian cavalry are closing at 30 miles per hour, hooves shaking the ground. Campbell walks calmly behind his men and says, "There is no retreat from here, men. You must die where you stand." Then adds quietly, "But I know you'll stand firm." What happens in the next 10 minutes will become legendary. William Howard Russell, the Times war correspondent watching from nearby hills, will describe it as a thin red streak tipped with steel. The phrase will be shortened to the thin red line and enter military history as the symbol of British discipline against impossible odds. But here's the real question. Was this tactical brilliance or a gamble that happened to work because the Russians hesitated? The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 stands as one of history's most unnecessarily catastrophic conflicts. Britain and France are fighting Russia over competing claims to protect Christian holy sites in Ottoman Palestine. But really, it's about preventing Russian expansion toward warm water ports in the Mediterranean. The war's strategic objective is capturing Sevastopol, Russia's naval fortress in Crimea. British and French forces land in September 1854 and begin a siege that will drag on for 11 brutal months. Thousands die from cholera, dysentery, and exposure to the bitter Crimean winter. Disease kills far more than Russian bullets. The British Army's command structure is a disaster. Lord Raglan, the commander-in-chief, last saw combat at Waterloo 39 years earlier. His cavalry divisions are commanded by aristocrats who purchased their commissions with family wealth rather than earning them through competence. There's no professional staff system, logistics are catastrophic, and communication between commanders routinely breaks down. Soldiers are tough professional veterans, many with service in India, but they're led by men whose primary qualification is birth rather than ability. Into this shambles steps Sir Colin Campbell, and he's different. Born Colin MacIver, he took his mother's surname Campbell and spent 40 years rising through merit in an army that valued breeding over competence. At 62, he's a soldier's officer who's proven himself in the Peninsular War and India. His men trust him completely because he's never wasted their lives through incompetence or vanity. He commands the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders, approximately 550 Scotsmen from northern Scotland, veterans who've served together for years. Balaclava is a small port town that the Allies captured to supply their siege of Sevastopol 7 miles away. It's defended by a thin line of fortifications, several redoubts, small hilltop forts manned by Turkish troops, stretching along the causeway heights overlooking the port. British cavalry divisions sit in reserve in the valley. Campbell's Highlanders guard the port itself. Most British infantry are committed to the siege lines, so Balaclava's defences are stretched dangerously thin. If the Russians capture it, the British supply line collapses and the entire siege fails. On October 25th, the Russians attack with 25,000 troops under General Liprandi. Their objective is simple: seize the causeway heights, push through to Balaclava, destroy the British base. At dawn, Russian artillery opens fire on the Turkish redoubts. Russian infantry assaults follow. The Turkish troops defend bravely, but are overwhelmed by sheer numbers. By 8 o'clock, the Russians control the heights and have captured British naval guns positioned there. The first defensive line has collapsed. Now there's a gap between the Russian-held heights and Balaclava port, and the only British force in that gap is Campbell's 93rd Highlanders, standing on a low ridge with the port and its hospitals, supply depots, and base personnel behind them. The question becomes whether 500 Scotsmen can hold that gap long enough for help to arrive. 8:30 in the morning. The British Heavy Cavalry Brigade responds to the Russian breakthrough. General James Scarlett commands approximately 800 heavy dragoons, big men on big horses, designed for shock charges. He orders them forward to counter Russian cavalry threatening to exploit the gap in British defences. What follows is brutal and extraordinary. The heavy brigade charges uphill into over 2,000 Russian cavalry. It's textbook wrong. Cavalry charging uphill surrenders momentum. But Scarlett has no choice. The dragoons crash into the Russian formation, and it becomes savage hand-to-hand fighting with sabres. For perhaps 10 minutes, 800 British cavalry are locked in desperate melee with more than twice their number. Then the Russians break, withdrawing back toward the heights. The heavy brigade has won, but they're exhausted, horses blown, unable to continue. They've stopped the immediate breakthrough, but cannot pursue. This creates Campbell's problem. The Causeway Heights remain in Russian hands. The heavy brigade has bought time, but is now spent as a fighting force. The Light Brigade, Britain's other cavalry division, sits in reserve, poorly positioned to intervene. Between the Russian-held heights and Balaclava port, there's open ground with only Campbell's Highlanders defending it. Behind them, Balaclava holds wounded men in hospital, supply dumps keeping the entire British army functioning, and base personnel who cannot fight. There's nowhere to retreat. If Campbell's line breaks, Russian cavalry pour into the port, and the campaign collapses. Around 9 o'clock, Russian cavalry on the heights regroup. Approximately 2,000 horsemen, estimates vary, but certainly over 1,500, form up and begin moving downhill toward Campbell's position. They're testing whether the gap is truly open, probing for weakness. If they find it, the full Russian force will exploit it. Campbell watches them approach. His force consists of roughly 500 Highlanders actually in the firing line, plus perhaps 50 wounded Turkish soldiers who've joined them and some local volunteers. Against 2,000 cavalry, that's odds of 4-1. His officers ride up with the obvious suggestion, form square. It's standard doctrine against cavalry, proven at Waterloo and 100 other battles. Squares are defensive, yes, but they're safe. Cavalry cannot break a properly formed square because horses won't charge into a wall of bayonets. Campbell refuses. He orders line formation, 2 ranks deep, stretching across the front. His officers are stunned. Line formation has exposed flanks. Cavalry can ride around the ends and attack from the side where the formation is vulnerable. It's in every manual as what not to do against cavalry. But Campbell has reasons. Line formation allows every rifle to fire, maximum firepower. His Highlanders carry Minié rifles, the new rifled muskets accurate to 600 yards, far superior to old smoothbores. In square, only the outer ranks can fire, reducing his firepower by 3/4. In line, he can deliver devastating volleys at long range. He's gambling that rifle fire will stop the cavalry before they close, that the Russians are probing rather than committing, and that his Highlanders' discipline will hold. The Russian cavalry begin their advance, building from trot to canter, moving downhill toward that impossibly thin red line. Campbell walks behind his 2-rank line as the Russian cavalry close the distance. Front rank kneeling, rear rank standing behind them. The formation stretches perhaps 150 yards across, with visible gaps between soldiers, because there simply aren't enough men to make it solid. It's literally a thin red line against a mass of cavalry that looks like a moving wall. Campbell's voice carries clearly. "There is no retreat from here, men. You must die where you stand." He pauses, then adds with absolute confidence, "But I know every man will stand firm." The Highlanders respond, "Aye, Sir Colin, we'll do it." 800 yards. The Russian cavalry are building speed, moving downhill from the Causeway Heights. Some are veering slightly, not a perfectly direct charge, but close enough. The ground trembles with hoofbeats. Campbell stands behind his centre, watching, calculating distance. 600 yards. He orders, 93rd, Steady! The Highlanders remain motionless, rifles ready, but not yet raised. The cavalry mass grows larger, individual riders becoming visible. 400 yards. Campbell. Make ready. 500 Highlanders bring Minié rifles to their shoulders in perfect unison. Front rank kneeling aims low. Rear rank standing aims slightly higher. Every man sighting down his barrel at the approaching cavalry. 200 yards. Campbell. Present. Fingers move to triggers. The Russian cavalry are close enough now to see faces, the coloured pennants on lances, the details of uniforms. The psychological pressure is immense. Cavalry charging directly at you whilst you stand in a thin line with exposed flanks. But the Highlanders hold. 150 yards. Campbell waits one more heartbeat. Fire! The entire line erupts in a simultaneous volcanic roar. 500 rifles discharge at once. The sound is physical, a thunderclap that echoes off the hills. Smoke instantly obscures everything in a thick grey-white cloud. For several seconds, nobody can see the effect. Then the smoke begins clearing. Russian cavalry are down. Riders thrown from saddles, horses collapsing, the formation disrupted. Gaps appear where men were, but the cavalry haven't broken entirely. They're slowing, reforming, still coming forward, though more hesitantly now. 93rd, reload! Campbell's voice cuts through. The Highlanders work their rifles with mechanical precision. Ramrods withdraw cartridges, push them down barrels, prime firing caps. 15 seconds for well-drilled soldiers. The Russian cavalry are trying to maintain momentum, but casualties and smoke have shaken them. Some sections are veering away from the direct line. Others continue advancing, but more slowly. 100 yards now. Fire! The second volley crashes out. More Russians fall. Horses rear, spooked by the noise and smoke and sudden casualties amongst their fellows. The cavalry formation is fragmenting, different sections reacting differently. Some turn away entirely, others slow to a walk. And then a few eager young Highlanders break ranks and rush forward, wanting to pursue the wavering cavalry with bayonets. Campbell's parade ground voice erupts. 93rd! 93rd! Damn all that eagerness! The men stop instantly and return to their positions. Campbell has prevented a potential disaster. If the line broke up pursuing cavalry, the Russians could counter and cut down scattered soldiers. The Russian cavalry are withdrawing, turning back toward the causeway heights. Not routing, but retreating in reasonable order, having decided this position costs too much to probe further. The entire action has lasted perhaps 10 minutes. The Highlanders still stand in their thin red line. Balaclava port behind them remains secure. 2 hours pass. Around 11 o'clock, the same morning produces the opposite outcome. Lord Raglan sits on the heights above the battlefield, surveying the situation through his telescope. The Russians still hold the causeway heights and the captured Turkish redoubts. Raglan sees Russian troops beginning to remove the captured British naval guns. Valuable artillery he doesn't want to lose. He scribbles a hasty order and sends it via Captain Louis Nolan to Lord Lucan, commanding the cavalry in the valley below. The order reads, Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front and prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. The problem is visibility. From Raglan's elevated position, he can see which guns he means, those in the captured redoubts on the heights. From Lucan's position in the valley, those guns aren't visible. What Lucan can see is a Russian artillery battery positioned at the far end of the valley, approximately 1.5 miles away. He asks Nolan, "Which guns?" Nolan, who despises Lucan, allegedly gestures vaguely toward the valley end with barely concealed contempt. Lucan interprets this as ordering an attack on that distant battery. Lord Cardigan commands the Light Brigade, about 670 light cavalry. He receives Lucan's interpretation of Raglan's order and immediately recognizes it as suicide. The valley stretches 1.5 miles with Russian artillery positioned on both flanking heights, plus the battery at the end. His brigade would charge into a 3-sided killing ground. But Cardigan and Lucan despise each other through family feuding, and orders are orders. At 11:10, the Light Brigade charges. 670 cavalry advance down that valley at increasing speed, building from trot to canter to gallop. Russian artillery on both heights opens fire. Round shot and canister tear through the formations. Men and horses fall in groups, holes appearing in the charging lines that close up as survivors press forward. They charge through this hell for a mile and a half, reaching the Russian guns at the valley end, where they briefly engage in hand-to-hand fighting before being overwhelmed by Russian cavalry counterattacks. They retreat back through the same murderous crossfire. Of 670 who charged, only 195 return unhurt. 118 are dead, 127 wounded, over 230 horses killed. The Light Brigade has been destroyed as an effective unit, achieving absolutely nothing tactically. French Marshal Bosquet watches from nearby heights. His comment becomes famous. C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la guerre, c'est de la folie. It is magnificent, but it is not war. It is madness. Same day, same battlefield, two cavalry actions with opposite results. The thin red line at 9 o'clock. Disciplined defense by a competent commander, minimal casualties, complete success in holding the position. The Light Brigade at 11 o'clock. Suicidal attack caused by command incompetence and aristocratic pride. 40% casualties. Tactical failure achieving nothing. Both actions will become legendary, but for entirely different reasons. One showed what the British Army could achieve through discipline and sound leadership. The other showed what happened when courage was wasted through command dysfunction. The Crimean War in miniature. Extraordinary individual bravery masking catastrophic systemic failure at the command level. So why did Campbell's thin red line succeed whilst the Light Brigade was slaughtered? First, examine the weapons. The Highlanders carried Minié rifles, muskets with rifled barrels featuring spiral grooves that spin the bullet, dramatically improving accuracy. Effective range, 600 yards compared to perhaps 100 yards for old smoothbore muskets. The Russian cavalry didn't expect to be hit hard at 150 yards. That surprise disrupted their charge before it built proper momentum, creating casualties and confusion at a range where they should have been safe. The psychological impact was enormous. Being struck down by accurate fire before closing distance shakes any cavalry formation. Second, discipline. Highland regiments were legendary for steadiness under pressure. The 93rd were combat veterans who'd served together for years and trusted Campbell absolutely. They waited for his fire command despite cavalry thundering toward them. They held formation when every instinct screamed to run or cluster together defensively. When some rushed forward after the volleys, they returned to ranks immediately when Campbell ordered it. That level of discipline cannot be trained quickly. It's the product of years of service under a commander who's proven he won't waste lives through incompetence. Within hours, both actions were being reported to Britain by William Howard Russell, the Times correspondent who'd watched from the hills above Balaclava. Russell described the Highlanders as appearing from distance like a thin red streak tipped with a line of steel. The red from their uniform coats, the steel from their bayonets. The British public immediately shortened it to the thin red line, and the phrase entered the language as shorthand for British military resilience. Campbell became a national hero overnight. He was promoted, continued service through the Crimean War's conclusion, and was sent to India during the rebellion of 1857, where he commanded forces relieving Lucknow in another famous action. In 1858, he was created Baron Clyde. He died in 1863, aged 71, and was buried in Westminster Abbey with full military honours. The 93rd Regiment carried Thin Red Line as part of their identity thereafter, the phrase becoming regimental motto and legend. But here's the curious aspect. The Light Brigade's charge became more famous than Campbell's successful defence. Within weeks, Alfred Lord Tennyson published his poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. Into the Valley of Death rode the 600, which captured Victorian imagination precisely because it was tragic gallantry, noble failure, heroic sacrifice, achieving nothing but demonstrating courage. The British public could romanticize that more easily than Campbell's competent, successful defense. The thin red line was merely soldiers doing their duty well under good leadership. Less poetic. The Light Brigade was glorious disaster, which somehow appealed more to Victorian sensibilities. Modern historians debate the details. Perhaps the numbers were smaller. Maybe 400 Highlanders actually in the firing line, not 500. Perhaps the Russian cavalry numbered 1,500 rather than 2,000. Perhaps they never intended a full commitment, just a reconnaissance in force that withdrew when it met unexpected resistance. Fair points worth considering. But strip away potential exaggerations and the core remains. A substantially outnumbered force successfully defended a vital position through discipline, leadership, and tactical sense. Whether you call it history's greatest cavalry charge repelled or merely a successful deterrence of a probe, the outcome was the same. Balaclava remained secure. The Crimean War itself dragged on until September 1855, when Sevastopol finally fell after 11 months of siege. The war achieved little strategically, whilst killing hundreds of thousands through combat, disease, and exposure. It exposed the British Army's catastrophic command structure, leading eventually to reforms, including abolition of the purchase system in 1871. Florence Nightingale's nursing reforms came directly from the medical disasters she witnessed in Crimean hospitals. Roger Fenton's photographs brought war's reality to British public consciousness for the first time. Russell's war correspondence created modern battlefield journalism. The contrast between Campbell's competence and the aristocratic officers' incompetence highlighted the British Army's fundamental problem: leadership based on wealth and birth rather than merit and ability. Campbell rose through 40 years of proving himself. Raglan, Lucan, and Cardigan bought their positions. One succeeded through tactical judgment. The others failed through pride and poor communication. But the system didn't change quickly. Even after the Crimean War's disasters, reform took decades because it threatened the aristocratic privilege that controlled the army. The thin red line became metaphor beyond its original context. In both world wars, British forces described themselves as thin red lines holding against German advances. Modern usage applies it to any small force defending against superior numbers. The phrase transcended Campbell and the Highlanders, becoming symbol for resilience itself. So how did 93 Highlanders, actually closer to 500, stop 2,000 Russian cavalry by standing in a two-rank line when doctrine said, "Form square"? The answer isn't a single factor, but multiple elements combining perfectly. Campbell read the Russian cavalry's intent correctly, recognizing they were probing rather than committing to breakthrough at any cost. He had Minié rifles that could hit accurately at ranges where smoothbore muskets were useless, turning that 150 yards into a killing ground the Russians didn't expect. He commanded Highland veterans whose discipline held whilst cavalry charged directly at them. He demonstrated personal leadership by walking calmly behind his line, stating the stakes honestly whilst expressing complete confidence. And the Russians, having been mauled by the heavy brigade earlier, made the tactical decision that this position was too strong for a probe without infantry and artillery support. Remove any single element, and the outcome might change. Without the Minié rifles, volleys wouldn't have been effective at that range. Without Highland discipline, men might have panicked or clustered defensively. Without Campbell's tactical judgment, they might have formed square and delivered insufficient firepower to deter attack. Without Russian caution after their earlier beating, they might have committed fully and flanked the exposed line. Success required everything aligning, which is why Campbell's gamble was exactly that, a calculated risk based on reading the situation correctly. The tactical lesson is that doctrine exists for good reasons, but isn't absolute. Forming square against cavalry is doctrinally correct because it's safer and more reliable. Campbell broke that rule because he understood the specific circumstances: superior weapons allowing effective long-range fire, disciplined troops who'd hold under pressure, enemy hesitation creating opportunity, and strategic necessity requiring decisive deterrence rather than merely passive survival. He tailored his response to the situation rather than blindly following procedure. That's what separates competent commanders from those who rigidly apply doctrine regardless of context. Compare this to the Light Brigade 2 hours later. They followed orders that made no tactical sense, charging into a killing ground because aristocratic pride prevented questioning vague instructions. Campbell disobeyed tactical doctrine intelligently. The Light Brigade obeyed operational orders stupidly. One showed judgment, the other showed blind obedience, producing catastrophe. Same day, same battlefield, opposite approaches to command authority. The phrase "thin red line" endures because it captured something larger than one morning's action. It symbolized the idea that small forces with discipline and leadership could achieve what seemed impossible. Whether the legend precisely matches historical reality matters less than what it represents. That human factors like morale, trust between commander and troops, tactical adaptation, and calm under pressure can overcome numerical disadvantage. The Highlanders didn't win through superior numbers or technology alone. They won through the combination of all factors working together under competent leadership. Campbell's success highlighted what the British Army could achieve when led by merit rather than birth. He rose through 40 years of proving himself whilst his superiors purchased their positions with family wealth. His tactical judgment saved 500 lives and secured a vital position. Their incompetence killed 250 Light Brigade troopers, achieving nothing. The contrast couldn't be starker. Sometimes doing the textbook wrong thing is exactly right if you understand why the rules exist and when circumstances justify breaking them. That's the real lesson of the thin red line.